Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And before we get to today's topic, just wanted to mention the passing of Orson Bean. Very sad. Orson Bean was the voice of Bilbo Baggins in the 1977 animated Hobbit movie. I still have that DVD. I watch it a couple of times a year. Loved his interpretation of Bilbo. I think he also played the voices of Bilbo and Frodo in the Return of the King animated movie. So thank you, Orson Bean, for inspiring me and bringing me so much joy throughout my childhood, into my adulthood as it turns out. And thank you for everything. Rest in peace, Orson Bean. So today's topic comes to us from commenter Dale Pride, who requested a video about the history of the Grey Havens. Great topic idea. Let's get to it. Okay, so the Grey Havens, we know them in The Lord of the Rings. That is where the ships sail to the west. At the very end of Return of the King, we've got Frodo and Gandalf and the rest sailing off from the Grey Havens. But we don't hear a lot about the Grey Havens during the meat of the story. And there is a lot of backstory to the Grey Havens and the Lord of those havens, Círdan, who in many ways embodies what the Grey Havens are all about. To talk about the Grey Havens, we're going to go back to the end of the First Age. Remember, the War of the Ring is happening in the Third Age. So thousands of years earlier, we're in the First Age, and the region that's going to end up becoming the Grey Havens don't exist yet, is a region called Lindon. And Lindon, that's known as the Land of Music. It's also known as Assyriand, the Land of Seven Rivers. And it is on the eastern border of a large landmass called Beleriand. Then the War of Wrath happens. The army of the Valar comes in, takes out Morgoth, in so doing, destroys the world. And actually a very worthy nerd, whose name unfortunately I couldn't find, did an awesome map. I'm going to put it up for you. It shows the amount of land that sank into the sea at the end of the First Age as a result of the War of Wrath. And on that map you can see, obviously the devastation, but also the what used to be the eastern border of Beleriand, Lindon, is now the western border of Middle-earth. So it becomes a shoreline. It wasn't a shoreline, it was a green forest land, an inland forest filled with green elves, but in the Second Age, it's now a coast. And so obviously you've got this brand new coast, you're like, oh, maybe we should get a port city here. And so in Lindon, the Grey Havens are created. Círdan, who I just mentioned, becomes Lord of the Grey Havens, while Gil-galad, the Elven King, is the ruler of the region of Lindon. And I should note, this destruction and the fact that everything to the west of Lindon was put underwater is a reminder of that destruction that occurred when the Valar came to aid Middle-earth, right? So at the end of that First Age, the Valar showed up. They defeated Morgoth, but at the cost of the continent, essentially, which is one of the main reasons why the Valar didn't send another army to fight in the War of the Ring. They're like, well, we'd rather not destroy Middle-earth. Let's let them try to solve this problem on their own, with the help of Gandalf and company. Here's a quote about the formation of the Grey Havens from the Silmarillion. In the great battle in the fall of Thangorodrim, there were mighty convulsions in the earth, and Beleriand was broken and laid waste. And northward and westward many lands sank beneath the waters of the great sea. In the east, in Assyriand, the walls of Ered Luin were broken, and a great gap was made in them towards the south, and a gulf of the sea flowed in. Into that gulf the river Lune fell by a new course, and it was called therefore the Gulf of Lune. That country had of old been named Lindon by the Noldor, and this name it bore thereafter. And many of the Eldar still dwelt there, lingering, unwilling yet to forsake Beleriand, where they had fought and labored long. Gil-galad, son of Fingon, was their king, and with him was Elrond, half-elven. Upon the shores of the Gulf of Lune, the elves built their havens and named them Mithlond, and there they held many ships, for the harborage was good. From the grey havens the Eldar ever set sail, fleeing from the darkness of the days of earth, for by the mercy of the Valar, the firstborn could still follow the straight road and return, if they would, to their kindred in Valinor. So again, just showing them the amount of destruction that happened there, and then the formation of the havens. And so what you've got is this harbor with these ships, and it's mostly one-way traffic, right? It's mostly elves heading west to Valinor. However, there are exceptions, a la Valinor sends the Istari, a la Gandalf and Saruman and such, east, and they land at the Grey Havens. Another group that lands at the Grey Havens are the Numenoreans. So around the year 600 of the Second Age, the first Numenorean ship arrives at the Grey Havens. It's captained by Veantur. He's like captain of the ships of Numenor. He makes contact with Gil-galad, sets up a friendship. That friendship is carried on through Aldarion. I've mentioned him in a previous video. He becomes Tar Aldarion, king of Numenor, and they have a very strong friendship, Gil-galad and Aldarion. The kings that come after that, the friendship kind of wanes a little bit, but when the time comes, 1695 of the Second Age, and Sauron attacks the elves, Gil-galad calls for aid. Numenor, help us! And it takes 5 years, but eventually, in 1700, the navy arrives from Numenor, a sizable navy. And they arrive basically just in the nick of time. Sauron is closing in on Lindon, is threatening to take it over. Numenoreans show up, and the combination of Numenor and the elves push Sauron back. Lindon is saved. So now we're going to jump forward in the Second Age to, I think it's 3320 of the Second Age. So, over 1,000 years has passed since Lindon was saved there by the Numenoreans. But at this point, Numenor needs saving because it collapses into the sea. The downfall of Numenor. Elendil and his sons, they've got their 7 ships. They sail out to Middle-earth. En route, the ships kind of get lost from each other. And Elendil ends up making shore in Lindon. He also befriends Gil-galad. As a gift to their friendship, Gil-galad builds these 3 white towers. And the tallest and westernmost of these 3 towers, which are built very close to the Grey Havens, just outside the Grey Havens, Elendil places one of the Palantiri. He brought the 7 Palantiri, the seeing stones, with him. One of them he places in this white tower. It's called Elendil's stone because Elendil spends a lot of time in that tower gazing west. That particular stone is not plugged into the network, as it were, of the other 6 stones. There's 6 Palantiri that talk to each other. There's one that doesn't. It only looks west towards Valinor. And Elendil spends his time up in this tower gazing west. Those towers are still around in the Third Age. Elves make pilgrimages to these white towers, usually from Rivendell. It is a lasting reminder of the friendship between elves and men. And in fact, that friendship is what leads to this War of the Last Alliance. It's not long after that Elendil and Gil-galad decide to march on Sauron. And they do so, and obviously the War of the Last Alliance, we've seen that depicted at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring in the movies. And tragically, Gil-galad and Elendil, these 2 friends, mighty kings, are both killed by Sauron. For Elendil, it's his son Isildur that takes over in his stead. For Gil-galad, it's essentially Círdan. Círdan was the Lord of the Grey Havens, this port city. When Gil-galad passes away, it's Círdan that takes over Lindon. So now we're going to jump to the year 1000 of the Third Age. This is a very important moment because this is when Gandalf arrives at the Grey Havens and meets Círdan. Now, Círdan, I'll talk more about Círdan later because he really is instrumental to the character and nature of the Grey Havens. But for now, Suffice to say, he actually has a bit of the gift of prophecy. And he realizes what Gandalf represents. He also knows exactly where he's come from. He's one of the only individuals on Middle-earth who really knows the true background of Gandalf for a long time. And we actually have a little conversation that Círdan has with Gandalf. And this is from the Silmarillion. At the first, that ring, Narya, the Ring of Fire, had been entrusted to Círdan, Lord of the Havens. But he had surrendered it to Mithlond, for he knew whence he came, and whither at last he would return. Take now this ring, he said, for thy labors and thy cares will be heavy. But in all it will support thee and defend thee from weariness, for this is the Ring of Fire. And herewith, maybe, thou shalt rekindle hearts to the valor of old in a world that grows chill. But as for me, my heart is with the sea, and I will dwell by the grey shores, guarding the havens until the last ship sails. Then I shall await thee. So, Círdan had been entrusted with one of the 3 elven rings, the Ring of Fire. Gandalf arrives from Valinor, obviously with a mission to help inspire humanity to take on Sauron. Círdan recognizes this instantly and decides this is the guy who needs this elven ring. And so he gives, willingly, Gandalf the Ring of Fire and tells him, I will await you. I will still be here when you finished your labors and need a ride back to the west. It's pretty impactful. So the role of the Grey Havens at the end of the War of the Ring is obviously very important, and I will be covering that here in a second. But there are a couple of other interesting historical tidbits of which Grey Havens play a part. And the first of those happens almost 1,000 years after Gandalf has arrived. And this is where the Witch King has been attacking kind of the remnants of Arnor, Arthedain. And our current king of Arthedain, Arvedui, is on the run. He escapes up to the north, and he's in what's called the Bay of Forachel. And he is hanging out with tribesmen up there called the Losoth. And he and his men are freezing to death, but they're trying to hold out through the winter with these tribesmen. Well, Arvedui's son, Aranarth, comes to the Grey Havens and asks Círdan for help. And here is a quote actually from, I believe it's the appendices of The Lord of the Rings. Talks about just that moment. When Círdan heard from Aranarth, son of Arvedui, of the king's flight to the north, he at once sent a ship to Forachel to seek for him. The ship came there at last after many days because of contrary winds, and the mariners saw from afar the little fire of driftwood which the lost men contrived to keep alight. But the winter was long in loosing its grip that year, and though it was then March, the ice was only beginning to break and lay far out from the shore. Okay, so at this point, the mariners from the Grey Havens managed to weave their way through the ice and get to Arvedui and his men. The Losoth give him counsel. They say, hey, this weather is terrible. If you get on that boat, you are probably going to die. Maybe use the boat for supplies or something, but you should probably wait till this weather passes and gets warmer before you actually get on this boat and head back to the Grey Havens. Arvedui's having none of it. I guess he's just like, look, we're cold. We're dying. I want to get back in the game. We're getting on this boat. He gets on the boat, and unfortunately, tragedy strikes. Yet the counsel of the Losoth was good, by chance or by foresight. For the ship had not reached the open sea when a great storm of wind arose and came with blinding snow out of the north, and it drove the ship back upon the ice and piled ice up against it. Even the mariners of Círdan were helpless, and in the night the ice crushed the hull, and the ship foundered. So perished Arvedui, last king, and with him the Palantiri were buried in the sea. So, huge moment there, not just for Arvedui and the Palantiri, but also for Círdan's men, right? These were mariners from the Grey Havens that also lost their lives in this moment. And this boat sank. And 2 Palantiri were lost to the bottom of the sea, never to be found again. It does make me think, if this tragedy had somehow been avoided, if, let's say, Arvedui listened to the Losoth and decided, come back later, and everything had worked out, and Arvedui comes to the Grey Havens with the Palantiri, because he took them because his cities were being destroyed, and he was kind of one step ahead of the Witch King carrying these Palantiri. He probably keeps them, he probably puts them somewhere else, but perhaps I could imagine a scenario where he's like, look, temporarily, you guys already have one of these in a tower, maybe you keep the other 2 for safekeeping for now. And you could have had, theoretically, 3 of the Palantiri stationed at the Grey Havens for some period of time. That never happened. Arvedui, unfortunately, passed away, along with several of these elven mariners from the Grey Havens. So, shortly thereafter, Gondor decides it's time to help out with Arnor. And they send this massive navy to the Grey Havens to help. And again, we've got a passage from the Lord of the Rings appendices that tell us about this event. At last, in the autumn of 1973, messages came to Gondor that Arthedain was in great straits and that the Witch King was preparing a last stroke against it. Then Yarnil sent his son, Yarnur, north with a fleet, as swiftly as he could, and with as great strength as he could spare. Too late. Before Yarnir reached the havens of Lindon, the Witch King had conquered Arthedain, and Arvedui had perished. But when Yarnir came to the Grey Havens, there was joy and great wonder among both elves and men. So many were his ships that they could scarcely find harborage, and from them descended an army of power, with munition and provision for a war of great kings. Or so it seemed to the people of the north, though it was but a small sending force of the whole might of Gondor. Then Círdan summoned all who would come to him, from Lindon or Arnor, and when all was ready, the host crossed the Lune and marched north to challenge the Witch King of Angmar. He was now dwelling, it is said, in Fornost, which he had filled with evil folk usurping the house and rule of the kings. In his pride, he did not await the onset of his enemies in his stronghold, but went out to meet them, thinking to sweep them, as others before, into the Lune. But the host of the west came down on him out of the hills of Evendim, and there was a great battle on the plain. Gondor sends this giant army, which apparently isn't so giant, because at this point Gondor is almost at the height of its power. And they arrive in the Grey Havens, and there's not even room for all of their ships in the harbor. And this massive army joins up with Círdan's army. He summons one, and they unite this giant force to go take on the Witch King. Witch King is a little overconfident. Overconfidence seemed to be his ultimate downfall, after all, when he was so cocky about the prophecy. But he takes them on in the field of battle, loses, is driven off by Glorfindel, and the good guys win the day in that moment, with the help of Grey Havens and Círdan. So now we're up to the time of the War of the Ring. And Tolkien inserts this passage in the Fellowship of the Ring that then gets replayed at the end of Return of the King. And when I read you these passages, and you can hear the similarity in them, they will probably sound familiar to you if you are familiar with the movies. Because what Peter Jackson did, he was obviously inspired by these lines as well. And he puts these lines into the mouth of Gandalf. Gandalf is talking to Pippin in Return of the King in Minas Tirith. And the enemy is pounding on the gates, and Pippin and Gandalf are contemplating their own mortality. And Gandalf consoles Pippin with this idea of perhaps the afterlife. And Peter Jackson took it from these quotes. I should also say that Annie Lennox uses some of these phrases in the Into the West song that was used for Fellowship of the Ring. It's a beautiful song, by the way, very moving. Part of the reason is because of these very moving words. So the first appearance of these words, as I mentioned, is in the Fellowship of the Ring. This is Frodo staying at Tom Bombadil's house. They've set out from the Shire, gotten to the Old Forest, and he has a dream And this dream is going to come to pass at the end of Return of the King. That night they heard no noises, but either in his dreams or out of them, he could not tell which, Frodo heard a sweet singing running in his mind, a song that seemed to come like a pale light behind a gray rain curtain, and growing stronger to turn the veil all to glass and silver, until at last it was rolled back, and a far green country opened before him under a swift sunrise. The vision melted into waking, and there was Tom whistling like a tree full of birds, and the sun was already slanting down the hill and through the open window. So this is his vision of arriving at the West. The idea that glass and silver, rolling the veil back and seeing this far green country under a swift sunrise. That's very evocative imagery and obviously inspiring to Peter Jackson. Now we cut to the end of Return of the King. Frodo has made his way from the Shire to the Grey Havens. It's very bittersweet. There's a somber quality to this that's really affecting and moving. When they had passed from the Shire, they came to the far downs and to the towers, and looked on the distant sea. And so they rode down at last to Mithlond, to the Grey Havens, in the long firth of Lune. As they came to the gates, Círdan the shipwright came forth to greet them. Very tall he was, and his beard was long, and he was grey and old, save that his eyes were keen as stars, and he looked at them and bowed and said, "All is now ready." Then Círdan led them to the havens, and there was a white ship lying, and upon the quay, beside a great grey horse, stood a figure robed all in white, awaiting them. As he turned and came towards them, Frodo saw that Gandalf now wore openly on his hand the third ring, Narya the Great, and the stone upon it was red as fire. Then those who were to go were glad, for they knew that Gandalf also would take ship with them. Then Frodo kissed Merry and Pippin, and last of all Sam, and went aboard. And the sails were drawn up, and the wind blew, and slowly the ship slipped away down the long grey firth, and the light of the glass of Galadriel that Frodo bore glimmered and was lost. And the ship went out into the high sea and passed on into the west, until at last on a night of rain Frodo smelled a sweet fragrance on the air and heard the sound of singing that came over the water. And when it seemed to him that as in his dreams in the house of Bombadil, the grey rain curtain turned all to silver glass and was rolled back, and he beheld white shores, and beyond them a far green country under a swift sunrise. So you see that imagery comes back around, and this is that moment when the hero's journey has completed. Note that Círdan has this long beard, which is fairly unusual for elves. It is due to his advanced age, and I'll talk more about that here in a second. We are told that Sam also takes that journey west as well. And there are, throughout the first 100 years or so of the Fourth Age, there are still elves passing to the west. In reading through Tolkien's letters for some fun information about the Grey Havens, there's actually a somewhat obscure Easter egg that comes in that's about this moment when Frodo and Gandalf and company go west. I'm going to read it to you because it's just a fun little Easter egg moment. But it also, part of this response that Tolkien has, it's a question. Somebody basically asked him, "Hey, did Shadowfax, the horse, go to the west?" Tolkien has a response. But in the middle of that response, he also basically validates this channel. He basically says, hey, I didn't write everything down. And, people are free to interpret from my words, what may or may not be true. So thank you, Tolkien, for validating the existence of Dork Lords. So here you go. Here is Tolkien responding to a question about whether Shadowfax the horse indeed went west with Gandalf. I think Shadowfax certainly went with Gandalf across the sea, though this is not stated. I feel it is better not to state everything, and indeed it is more realistic, since in chronicles and accounts of real history, many facts that some inquirer would like to know are omitted, and the truth has to be discovered or guessed from such evidence as there is. Ding ding! I should argue so. Shadowfax came of a special race, being as it were an elvish equivalent of ordinary horses. His blood came from west over sea. It would not be unfitting for him to go west. Gandalf was not dying or going by a special grace to the western land before passing on beyond the circles of the world. He was going home, being plainly one of the immortals, an angelic emissary of the angelic governors, Valar, of the earth. He would take, or could take, what he loved. Gandalf was last seen riding Shadowfax. He must have ridden to the Havens, and it is inconceivable that he would have ridden any beast but Shadowfax. So Shadowfax must have been there. If you remember back in the quote I just read you, it mentions there's a great gray horse is standing on the harbor. I'm picturing Círdan, seeing Gandalf ride up and say, "Oh, my horse is coming with me." When Círdan okay, I built this ship for people, but oh, sure, it's Noah's Ark. Any case, yes, Shadowfax made it to the west. But I just like that bit about how he's saying, hey, people can interpret. I didn't write everything down. There's room for interpretation. So we know that Círdan was waiting to take the last ship out. And at the time that Gandalf and Frodo and such go west, there are still other elves on Middle-earth looking to go west. So we know that Círdan himself didn't get on the boat with Frodo. So when was that last ship? When did that last ship sail with Círdan on it? Well, we had an idea for a date range. We don't know the exact date. It's not mentioned. But we've got a date of, this is when Aragorn dies. It's 120, the year 120 of the Fourth Age. So by the year 120, all elves who wanted to go west had gone west. Who was perhaps on that ship with Círdan, if anyone? I think we have one other candidate for being on that last ship. And again, we go back to the appendices. It is probable that Meriadoc obtained assistance and information from Rivendell, which he visited more than once. There, though Elrond had departed, his sons long remained, together with some of the high elven folk. It is said that Celeborn went to dwell there after the departure of Galadriel, but there's no record of the day when at last he sought the Grey Havens, and with him went the last living memory of the elder days in Middle-earth. So, first of all, interesting little side note there that Galadriel went west without Celeborn. They were together for thousands of years. And it's just interesting that she went, he stayed for a time. Eventually, he does go to the Grey Havens, and it says it doesn't know when he went, but when he left, it says, with him went the last living memory of the elder days in Middle-earth. Fair enough. He'd been there through various ages. Well, someone else who'd been there through various ages, Círdan. So if you say that the last living memory left, it supposes that Círdan wasn't still there, because if he was still in Middle-earth, well, there'd still be living memory around. So I think what that implies is that Celeborn and Círdan were on the last ship out of the Grey Havens. One other event that the Grey Havens play a small part is in the Council of Elrond. Círdan has sent a representative, Galdor, on an errand, and Galdor speaks for Círdan and the Grey Havens at the Council of Elrond. Actually has a lot to say, helps the decision-making process. And I think he's one of the ones who eventually agrees that it's a bad idea to take the ring west and try to throw it into the sea. I think he counsels that that's kind of what Sauron would expect. It's like, oh, it's the easiest thing to do. That's what Sauron would expect him to do, so we shouldn't do that. So there's a little input from the Grey Havens into the activities of the Fellowship of the Ring. One question I was trying to answer in doing the research on this was, how did the Grey Havens get their name? And it's not clear. I think there's a few options for how the Grey Havens got their name. One could just be the Grey Waters, maybe that veil of rain that it talks about, the Grey Curtain. Perhaps it's very rainy there. It also mentions, when I read that quote from the end of Return of the King, it said, "And slowly the ship slipped away down the long grey firth." So a firth is an inlet. That's the water that comes up to the Grey Havens. So perhaps that water itself is grey, and that's why it's called the Grey Havens. Also, Círdan is a grey elf. And since he is synonymous with the Grey Havens, perhaps there's something there. This is one of the Lord of the Grey Elves is in charge. Perhaps the Grey Havens get their name that way. In Elvish, it's Mithlond. Same idea, Grey Havens. Another possibility could be maybe more metaphorical. That here you've got the Grey Havens are on the western shore. So they're almost as close as you can get to Valinor while still being in Middle-earth. And it's the last stop for the elves before they then arrive in Valinor. And so perhaps the Grey Havens is almost like it's gray turning to light. You know, you're almost to the light of Valinor. You're at the Grey Havens. Perhaps. So finally, I think I'm going to wrap up this video by talking about Círdan, since he really does embody what the Grey Havens are all about. He is one of the oldest elves in existence. He is likely from the first generation of elves that were created by Iluvatar and awoke long, long, long ago. He is the oldest living elf in Middle-earth. He's got a beard, remember? That's why he's got this beard, because he's ancient. And I think his story is one of self-sacrifice. Tolkien wrote that his greatest desire was to see the shores of Valinor. He and a group of elves are journeying through Beleriand to try to get to boats that will take them to Valinor, and his kinsman is lost along the way. Thingol, king of the elves, kinsman of Círdan, perhaps almost like a brother. Círdan refuses to go on without Thingol, and so waits for years trying to find Thingol, and gives up temporarily this desire to go west. When he's finally in a position to be able to go to the west, he receives a message from the Valar telling him to stay, that he still has a purpose on Middle-earth. That purpose ends up being that he helps to build a ship, Vingalot, for Yarendil. Yarendil is Elrond's father. He plays a huge part in the Tolkien mythology. But Círdan and Yarendil build a boat together that then Yarendil sails successfully to Valinor. He becomes the first mortal to ever successfully get to Valinor. Well, Círdan's not in that boat. Círdan built it, Yarendil sailed it, and the rest is history there. But again, so this is Círdan. His greatest desire is to go, but instead he's helping others to go. He helps Yarendil to go. Once the Second Age comes around, and now he is Lord of the Grey Havens, he pledges, again, though his desire is to go west, he pledges to protect and man these havens, build these boats, so that his elven kin can safely go to the west. And throughout the Second and Third Ages, many, many, many elves take him up on this offer, and they go to the Grey Havens, and they successfully sail to the west. And he's constantly building ships, and he's sending other elves on the way, knowing that he is not going to leave until everyone who wants to go has gone. That's thousands of years that go by, where again, he's still delaying his greatest desire. And so it is kind of a relief that at last he does finally get to go to Valinor. Here's this elf that's lived so long. It actually has the favor of the Valar. He's not, exiled or anything. They've actually given him somewhat of a gift of prophecy in return for staying in Middle-earth. So finally, it's rewarded. At long last, our long-bearded elf gets on a boat to the west. And so anyway, that is your Grey Havens in a nutshell. I hope you enjoyed that video. Dale Pride, thank you so much for the topic suggestion. I appreciate it. If you've got a topic for a video, please put it in the comments. I would love to do a video about a topic of your choosing. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye.